And welcome to the Lubar Center at Marquette Law School, where we are presenting the second segment of new results from a national poll by the Marquette Law School Poll. The first release on Wednesday, November 30th, was issues related largely to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then some other matters stemming from that. This one is much more political, the national political scene. This is a national poll, not a Wisconsin poll, and in fact, I'm Alan Borsuk. I'm a senior fellow here, and I'm here to say what subject we're talking about, and Professor Charles Franklin is here to then say what the subject really is. So welcome, Charles, and let's begin with, as we always do, the details of the poll itself.
So this is a national survey conducted November 15th through the 22nd, so the week after the midterm elections. We interviewed 1,004 adults nationwide, and that has a margin of error of 3.7 percentage points. However, we're also going to talk about some results about upcoming elections that involve the sample of registered voters. That's 840 registered voters with a margin of error of plus or minus 4 percentage points. And finally, when we look at Republican and Democratic issues, candidates, we look at Republicans, which is a margin of error of 6.1 percentage points, and the Democratic sample has a margin of error of 5.6 points. So be aware that the margin of error rises to around 6 points when we're looking at Democrats and Republicans, and it's about 4 percentage points when we're looking at registered voters, and a little bit less than that when we're talking about all adults in the population.
So let's get into it, and looking at the, dare we say, looming presidential race in 2024, and the interesting name of the moment is Ron DeSantis.
Ron DeSantis. Well, if the midterms have just occurred, it must be time to look ahead to presidential politics. I want to take just a moment to explain why we're asking about hypothetical elections more than 2 years or 2 years from now. The reason is not, I emphasize not, because today's opinions will reflect the outcome of that election. But the point is, if we don't look at where we stand today, we will have no knowledge of how we got to where we will be in the fall of 2024. And so I think it's important to emphasize that polling about these future hypothetical matchups are to inform where we are now and how we're changing. And in a couple of years, we can look back and see a record of how we got to wherever we are come November of 2024. So I think it's understandably often thought that these hypothetical matchup polls are a premature and no doubt incorrect forecast of where the election will end up in 2 years. I want to emphasize that it's so that we have a history of the path we take to get to where we're going over the next 2 years. So, having said that, let's see what has changed and where that matchup now stands. In a hypothetical 2024 election between Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and President Joe Biden, and here we're asking among registered voters, so that's the 4% margin of error I mentioned. And the thing that's so notable here is that this race between those two is now even, 42% for DeSantis and 42% for Biden. When we asked about this at the beginning of the year, in January of 2022, it was 34% for DeSantis, 43% for Biden. DeSantis' support has gradually but steadily increased over the year to now 42%. while Biden's began at 43 and it's bumped around in the low 40s and it's at 42 today. So very little change in support for President Biden, but a modest but steady growth in support for Governor DeSantis. I should say that 11% of the sample still say they would rather vote for someone else, and 4% say they wouldn't vote. So that 15% someone else or wouldn't vote also reflects a certain degree of dissatisfaction with being presented with these two choices. And that dissatisfaction can be an important part of the story of the next 2 years as well. So it's not that we're necessarily saying some third party on the ballot will get 11% of the vote for someone else, but we are saying that as a reflection of whether people wish they had other options, somewhat sizable, 15% would wish they had some other options. Incidentally, that's down from 22% that said they wanted someone else a year ago back in January. So a little more willingness to accept these two choices. But it does reflect some improvement of DeSantis and his emergence with as a potential even match against President Biden, should President Biden run.
And then there's that Donald Trump guy.
Yeah. Yes. So President Trump, of course, former President Trump, represents at the moment the declared candidate. He declared his candidacy for the Republican nomination on the day that we started this survey. That was a coincidence. But here, Biden continues to lead Trump as he has for the year. Biden gets 44% to Trump's 34%, so a 10-point margin in favor of Biden in this matchup. A somewhat higher 23% say they would vote for someone else or wouldn't vote, so a little more measure of dissatisfaction between these two candidates than the somewhat smaller 15% we saw with the DeSantis-Biden matchup. Here, though, Trump's support has remained pretty steady over the year. Back in January, it was 33%. It's 34% now. Biden was at 45% in January. He's at 44% now. So you can see there's just not very much movement at all in the Trump-Biden matchup. It's fluctuated by a handful of points, 3 or 4 points over the course of the year, but ends up pretty much where we started out. And again, this shows that Biden continues to hold a bit of an electoral advantage over Trump, even though DeSantis as an alternative now polls evenly with Biden. That's relevant for the question of electability, which primary electorates will have to consider as well.
So Trump has announced he's running. Do Republicans and those who lean Republican want him to run?
Yes, is the short answer. 55% of Republicans who are registered to vote, I should say, would like Trump to run. 45% would not. On the other hand, that's a decline from last survey in September, when it was 60% of Republicans wanting him to run, 40% not, and is down from the recent high water mark in July when 64% of Republicans wanted a Trump candidacy and 35% did not. So about a 10-point shift downward in wanting him to run and upwards in not wanting him to run. But still, a majority of Republicans saying they would like Trump running.
Do Democrats want Joe Biden to run?
Well, here, Democrats are not that thrilled with the Biden candidacy. 49% now would like him to run, and 51% not run. So basically an even split. That's slightly more support for him than in September, when 44% wanted him to run, 56% not run. So up about 5 points on favor him running, but still a close division on the question about the party's incumbent president and whether he should run again in 2 years.
Returning to Ron DeSantis, currently the governor of Florida, how's opinion about him evolved in recent polls?
Yeah, and again, we're looking at Republican voters here because we're thinking of this as a party contest for him. Not surprisingly, as a Republican, he's not viewed very favorably by Democrats, but for the Republican nomination, it's relevant to look at Republican voters. 68% have a favorable opinion of him, only 10% unfavorable among Republicans, but 22% still say they don't know enough about him to give an opinion. Now, in January of this year, 57% were favorable, so that's up 11 points. 9% unfavorable, up just 1 point this time from that. But in January, 34% didn't know enough to have an opinion. That's down to 22%. So you see with DeSantis someone who has a very good favorable to unfavorable ratio, 68 to 10, but still has 1 in 5 Republican voters who say they don't know enough about him yet, something that, again, is very common this far out from a presidential election. And if you look at the trend in opinion of DeSantis over this last year, his visibility has been steadily growing, but is still far from universal, unlike President Trump, who is nearly universally known.
The question of do you know enough about this person doesn't really apply to Donald Trump, though everybody has an opinion on him. Among Republicans, what is the state of opinion about him?
To be picky, 1% of our
1%,
Republicans said they didn't
Yes.
know enough about him to have an opinion. I'm a little concerned about that, but 1% say that.
Where have these people been?
Here, on the favorable side, where DeSantis was 68% favorable among Republicans, Trump is 67% favorable among Republicans. But the big difference is on unfavorable opinion. 32% of Republicans have an unfavorable view of Trump versus just 10% unfavorable to DeSantis. Where's the other difference? It's in that don't knows again, 1% that couldn't rate Trump versus 22% unable to rate DeSantis. So DeSantis's ratio of favorable to unfavorable is much stronger, but that ignores the people that don't know him. Trump has a higher unfavorable rating even among Republicans, but almost nobody in the party says they don't know him. So again, I think the takeaway here is DeSantis in favorability is now running even with Trump among Republicans, just as he's running even with Biden in a hypothetical matchup, which Trump trails by 10 points. And so this is all fodder for the notion of DeSantis as potentially emerging as a credible competitor to Donald Trump, but one who still has substantial don't knows. He still needs to introduce himself to the public.
A third Republican figure in the mix here is former Vice President Mike Pence, and he's not doing so well in terms of public opinion.
Not as well as DeSantis, surely, and among Republicans, not as well as President Trump. 51% of Republicans see Pence favorably and 40% unfavorably, with 9% failing to give an opinion. So at 9% is between the 1% with no opinion of Trump and the 22% no opinion of DeSantis. But his balance of favorable and unfavorable is 51 to 40, so a little better than an even split, but nowhere near as good as either DeSantis or Trump's net favorability among Republican voters. It's worth mentioning that for Pence over the last little more than a year, in November of 2021, Pence had a 65% favorable, 21% unfavorable with Republican voters. That fell off a little bit in January of this year to 57-31, which you see has continued in a gradual downward decline to now 51 favorable, 40 unfavorable. So this last year has not helped Mike Pence's standing with Republican voters. It has actually seen an erosion of that, though he still remains more favorable than unfavorable.
You put together an interesting set of numbers here on matching up people's opinion of Trump with their opinion of DeSantis.
Now, it's worth saying that DeSantis has not declared his intentions with regards to seeking the presidency. So we're looking at that. But we're looking at it in this case for among the Trump supporting coalition in the Republican Party, how do they feel about DeSantis? And the answer is they feel very good about DeSantis. Of Republicans who have a favorable view of Trump, fully 76% also have a favorable view of DeSantis. Only 4% of Trump-favorable Republicans have an unfavorable view of DeSantis, but 20% haven't heard enough, about the same as his national haven't heard enough. Among those who are unfavorable to Trump, actually DeSantis' support is a little bit weaker. 51% of those Republicans unfavorable to Trump are favorable to DeSantis, but 23% are unfavorable to DeSantis as well, and 27% not enough. So I think the takeaway here is that DeSantis does draw support from substantially the same group of Republicans that are favorable to Trump and that might be most inclined to support Trump in a second race for the presidency, but who certainly by today's data see DeSantis in a very favorable light as well. In that sense, the two are competitors and potential substitutes for one another. Whereas those Republicans who are most disenchanted with Donald Trump are not especially drawn to DeSantis as an alternative. In fact, they have a bigger unfavorable view of DeSantis than those favorable to Trump people do. So an interesting division within the party, with DeSantis and Trump maybe struggling over the same set of voters substantially, while those voters, Republicans disenchanted with Donald Trump, are on balance favorable to DeSantis, but not overwhelmingly so at all.
The complicated tale of relationship between Trump and Mike Pence is not, well, I guess it is relevant to this, but how does Pence do in relation to Trump supporters?
Well, here it's very different from DeSantis. Of Republicans that are favorable to Trump, 54% are favorable to Pence, but 39% are unfavorable. So in this sense, it shows that Trump supporters have not utterly rejected Mike Pence. He's more favorable than not, but is far more evenly divided than those same Trump-favorable Republicans have as views of Governor DeSantis. Of those with an unfavorable view of Trump, Republicans with an unfavorable view, opinion of Pence is almost exactly evenly split, 44 favorable, 45 unfavorable. So again, it's not that Pence is uniquely attractive to either Trump favorables or to Trump unfavorables. It's more of a very divided look for him among both elements of the Republican Party.
We asked people across the country, in this case, what issues are most important to them, particularly issues that are or could be coming up. What did we find?
Well, what we did was we went to recent policy statements from the Democratic members of Congress and the Republican members of Congress and picked 20 issues roughly from each party, and asked about whether you would like for Congress to pass this policy or not pass this policy in the upcoming year. And we encourage people to realize that maybe you don't think Congress will do them, but if they did, would you favor or not favor these things? So it's quite a selection. I'm tempted to read you all 20 results, but I will spare you that and encourage you.
It will be online.
It will be online,
Yes.
and it will be on the final exam, so you should study for this. But in all seriousness, the issues are in the press release and in our online resources at law.marquette.edu/poll. And so I encourage you to go and look at all 20 because I just want to hit the highlights here. The most popular issue, favored by 92% of all adult respondents, so we're now looking at all adults here, 92% favor limiting the cost of prescription drugs. And that issue was the top choice of independents and Democrats, but also the third highest support among Republican respondents. So a rare case of tripartisanship, if you will, Democrats, independents, and Republicans united on this issue, one that some legislation was passed last year, but it remains an important issue for the public and one that really does cut across partisan lines. There was also agreement on the least popular issue out of the 20 proposals, one that would require Congress to reauthorize Social Security and Medicare every 5 years, rather than let the programs continue automatically. That was favored by 32%, opposed by 68% among all respondents, but it ranks dead last of 20 issues with Republicans, fourth from the bottom with Democrats, and third from the bottom with independents. So this is an issue that we saw mentioned in actually Republican policy proposals, but it's one that really does not poll well across any of the three groups of partisans, independents, Democrats, and Republicans.
In addition to drug cost limitations, there were several issues that had pretty broad support across the spectrum.
Especially if you don't require that it be really at the very top of any group. Pass new voting rights laws that protect every citizen's right to vote. That ranks seventh out of 20 with Republicans and second with both Democrats and independents. So I think you could no doubt argue about exactly what the meaning of protect every citizen's right to vote might be, and it might be that Republicans and Democrats view that in different ways. But the fundamental point about protecting everyone's voting rights is something that also garners pretty high support across the parties.
And there were other issues in which the partisan divides were really sharp.
Not everything is sunny and light on this. One of the biggest partisan divides was pass a national law banning abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. That ranks 8th with 69% support among Republicans, but 18th out of 20 with Democrats. Only 19% of Democrats support it, and 17th out of 20 issues with independents, with 40% support. And one that undoubtedly we would have predicted had a big partisan divide is impeach Joe Biden. It is sharply partisan, ranked 9th with Republicans, last with Democrats, and 19 of 20 with independents. But I will point out that we asked about 20 issues, and this ranked 9th with Republicans. So it's not an especially high priority for Republican voters, even though, again, at least from some sides of the Republican Party, we've certainly heard talk about doing that in the new Congress.
So we won't go through all 20. Do you want to say what some of the things are that were the most,
well, I will.
Were at the top of the list
Sure.
overall?
I will do that. And I'm going to do it by party because the gaps between the parties are so striking. So among Republicans, the top 5 issues were increased efforts to stop illegal immigration on the southern border. That's the number 1. Increased production of oil and gas in the U.S., number 2. Limit the cost of prescription drugs, number 3, that we mentioned a moment ago. fund hiring of 200,000 more police officers nationwide with federal funds, number 4. And then number 5, conduct a congressional investigation of the FBI, something that we talked about confidence in the FBI in yesterday's release on confidence in institutions. Here you see the Republican doubts about the FBI rising. Among Democrats, the top 5 are prescription drug costs, a new Voting Rights Act, which we've both mentioned, increased funding for renewable energy production, such as wind and solar, rather than the Republican priority on oil and gas, increased taxes on incomes over $500,000, and increased federal aid to states and school districts to increase teacher compensation. So a little bit of overlap, actually, maybe more than you might have predicted a priori. There are 2 that make the top lists for both parties, but otherwise quite a bit of difference. And finally, if we look at independents, limit prescription drug costs is number 1, new voting rights law number 2, but number 3 for independents is increase aid to school districts for teacher compensation, and then create federal subsidies for child care costs, and finally, increase funding for renewable energy. So you see a difference there. Renewable energy ranks high with independents and Democrats, but ranks sort of pretty similar to oil and gas when you put everybody together. So there's a little bit of an implication that for the public at large, new energy resources are a priority, but Republicans prioritize fossil fuels, independents and Democrats prioritize renewables. Who knew?
Let's look at some specific issues. Aid to Ukraine, for example.
This is an emerging issue, especially with the change of partisan control of Congress, but it also reflects broader questions of America's role in the world that we wanted to get into a little bit. In that battery of 20 questions we've been talking about, we asked about cutting aid to Ukraine. First of all, though, knowledge about Ukraine is pretty high. 70% say they've heard a lot about the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 23% a little, and 7% nothing at all. 6% nothing at all. Sorry, I said it wrong. It was 7% nothing at all. And here, there's not much partisan difference. Democrats and Republicans are equally likely to say they've heard a lot. Only independents are a good bit lower at 51% that have heard a lot. With them, that's more of a reflection on relatively less attention to political news than partisans who, not surprisingly, pay more attention to political news. But when we asked this question on that set of 20 issues, it was, would you favor or oppose a policy that would sharply reduce U.S. military aid to Ukraine? 45% favor that reduction in aid, 55% oppose, about an even split. But there's a party gap. 58% of Republicans would sharply cut aid, 47% of independents, and just 34% of Democrats. So a fair party divide on aid, and a majority of Republicans who would favor cutting off, or sharply cutting, I should say, aid to Ukraine. However, these results are a little different when we frame the question differently. So a good deal later in the survey, after we've asked about a bunch of other issues regarding to the Supreme Court and other things, we explicitly frame the question this way. When it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, do you think the United States is providing too much support to Ukraine, not enough support to Ukraine, or about the right amount of support? So the difference here is now we are specifically mentioning that Russia invaded Ukraine, whereas the first question doesn't contain the invasion context and just asks sharply cut. What we find with this framing is only 32% say we're providing too much support. 23% not enough, and 45% about the right amount. So compared to the previous question, there is less support for cutting aid implicitly, that 32% that say we're supplying too much. But here again, there's a pretty sharp partisan difference. 48%, not quite a majority of Republicans say we're supplying too much support. That drops to 36% with independents and 17% with Democrats. So the extra context and maybe the difference between giving too much or too little support versus sharply cut, favor, or oppose are both differences in these questions. But it does show that the party difference is pretty substantial, and while on balance, majorities still support aid to Ukraine, there is a significant minority that would either cut that sharply or thinks we're providing too much support.
Do people think that what's going on in the war in Ukraine matters to the future of the United States?
I think this is one of those questions that became so important prior to World War II, when we had a large isolationist movement in the country. That was reshaped in World War II and then in the Cold War, post-World War II. And then it got refined and changed as we went through Korea and Vietnam and later the Gulf War and then Iraq and Afghanistan. And so here we are all these years later, and what was once a real consensus about the U.S. role in the world, post-World War II at least, has now become more controversial. So one of the ways to get at this is, how much do you think what happens in the Russia-Ukraine conflict matters to life in the United States? 39% say a great deal. 42% say some. 14% not much, and just 5% not at all. So there is quite a bit of a sense that at least somewhat the outcome in Ukraine matters to the United States. But the party differences are more modest on this question. Of Republicans, 34% say it matters a great deal. Independents, 37%, Democrats, 43%. So there's a little bit of a gap here, but it's not an enormous gap. And of those saying it matters some, 43% Republican, 49 Independent, 42 Democratic. So I do think you see here not a growing dismissal of international affairs as mattering to the U.S., and across parties, not a large gap in that. So it would be, I think, an exaggeration to say that we're seeing a resurgence of isolationist attitudes here. But there are some party differences. In the end, about 22% of Republicans say it doesn't matter much or at all. And for Democrats, that's about 14%. So a modest but measurable difference here. With Republican control of the House of Representatives comes responsibility for taking policy positions on aid to Ukraine. So here's a case where we'll see how this plays out and whether these attitudes that are pretty supportive of the importance to the U.S., but with some differences in skepticism about the funding we're providing, how those play out in the new Congress.
We also asked more globally how people felt America's role in world affairs should be handled. Should we be more active or less active?
And here there's a pretty strong consensus again. 60% say it's better for the country if we take an active part in world affairs, but 40% say we should stay out of world affairs. Again, I think that's probably a lot closer to a balance than we might have seen 60 years ago or 70 years ago. But Republicans, 55% say take an active part, 45% stay out. But Democrats, 70% take an active part, 30% stay out of world affairs. So a bit of a partisan divide there. The one little bit of surprise here is among independents. where a majority, 56% of independents say we should stay out of world affairs. 44% say we should take an active part. This merits further investigation. More research is needed, as we say at academic conferences. But one of the things that's emerged of independents is the extent to which they're disengaged from politics and disenchanted with both parties. Possibly we're seeing a little bit of a reflection of that in the responses of independents here. And it's worth following to see how that changes over time.
Confidence in elections, both 2022, the one we just had several weeks ago, and 2020, the election that never dies. What did we find in regard to the 2022 election?
Well, there's a bit more confidence in the outcome of the 2022 elections than there is in the 2020 election. With a few exceptions, we've managed to get through this year's elections with relatively few protests and without a major political figure saying the elections were stolen. That's not universal, but it's still pretty strong. This year, 71% are either very or somewhat confident that the election was accurately conducted. Just 29% not to or not at all confident. Republicans remain less confident. 49% are not to or not at all confident, while 50% are confident. Independents are on balance pretty confident, over 60%, and Democrats over 90% confident. By contrast, when we look back to 2020, confidence in that election is 64% overall and 35% not so confident. But here the difference by party stands out. Republicans remain pretty doubtful about 2020, with 61% expressing doubts about 2020. And remember, that was 49% expressing doubts about this year's election. So by that measure, this year's election fares better than the election 2 years ago among Republicans. Independents and Democrats are a little more confident in this year's election than they were in 2020. But on the other hand, Democrats and independents were pretty confident about the 2020 outcome. In the first place, 58% of independents confident about 2020, 89% of Democrats confident about 2020. And as I said, those bump up into the low 60s and low 90s among independents and Democrats for this year's election. So I think the conclusion is, widely speaking, both 2020 and 2022 find over 60% of the public confident in the outcome of either of those elections. It's a little bit higher this time. The major source of doubt is among Republicans about 2020, and Republicans are less doubtful about 2022, though still considerably more doubtful than their independent or Democratic counterparts. So a little bit of growing confidence across party, but the partisan differences in confidence in elections remains.
The job approval ratings of President Joe Biden, how's that going?
Pretty stable, actually, in this case. In September, he was at 45 approve, 55 disapprove. That's exactly what we have him now. 45 approve, 55 disapprove. So there's been a lot of speculation about the midterms and how that would affect his job rating, and at least by presidential approval, the election outcome didn't seem to change that very much at all. He is, of course, down from the first year of his presidency when he was over 50% for at least the first 6 months or so, but has been recovering a bit from his low watermarks last winter and early spring to now this still underwater 45-55, but that's been stable for the last 2 months.
Slightly different way of putting it. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of President Biden? How'd that come up?
It's not too surprising that favorability does mirror approval for incumbent presidents, with Biden 43 favorable, 53 unfavorable. 3% say they haven't heard enough. Republicans quite negative, independents pretty negative, 58% unfavorable with independents, but 92% of Republicans unfavorable. Democrats pretty favorable at 78%. But we wanted to compare that with some other presidents. So there's the previous president, Donald Trump. 32% have a favorable opinion, 66% an unfavorable. But among Republicans, it reverses that. 66% favorable among all Republicans, 32% unfavorable. Earlier, we looked at Republican registered voters. Now we're looking at Republicans, regardless of whether they're registered to vote or not. But Trump suffers among independents. 66% of them are unfavorable, and 95% of Democrats unfavorable.
We brought in a couple former presidents, Barack Obama and George W. Bush, to look at what opinion of them is at this point.
A little bit of the all-star team coming back, but also a little bit of whether, in retrospect, now with them both out of office for some time, how do opinions of them compare with the current and immediately previous president? For Obama, 62% of the total public have a favorable opinion, 34% unfavorable, notably higher than any of the others that we've looked at. But even among Republicans, 25% of Republicans have a favorable opinion, 73% unfavorable. That's still not a very good net favorability. But when you consider that less than 10% of Republicans have a favorable view of Joe Biden, it does show that there's some differentiation between two Democratic presidents there. Independents, quite favorable to Obama, 63%, and Democrats overwhelmingly favorable at 93%. Republicans are a little more divided on President George W. Bush, as is the country, though on balance positive. The overall favorability to Bush is 51 favorable, 40 unfavorable. But among Republicans, 59 favorable, 34 unfavorable. So here you see a divide in a Republican Party that's undergone considerable change since President Bush left office in 2009. Independents are a little unfavorable at 36 favorable, 45 unfavorable. But Democrats are just slightly favorable, 49 to 43 unfavorable. So a little bit of recovery for the former president, who routinely got less than 10% job approval from Democrats when he was in office. So by that standard, 49-43 looks pretty good for a post-presidency.
Time softens some of these things, I guess.
It does.
Or comparison with others,
Yes.
I don't know.
And so the bottom line here is that we do see variation across important political figures that the public has been intensely exposed to over the last 22 years, back to the beginning of the Bush presidency. But we also see that there is some shifting perspective, especially among Democrats, towards Bush. Among Republicans, who generally gave Obama less than 10% job approval ratings, the only thing to mention there is that in his last year, Republicans became somewhat more approving of Obama. So it's maybe a little more striking that Bush has recovered as much on favorability as he has, while the current Republican favorability to Obama is not far different from their last year of approval of Obama, which got into the high teens. But still, a little bit better overall for both of them. Get out of office, your approval numbers will go up.
Absence makes the heart grow fonder. And finally, Mar-a-Lago and the documents.
Just a simple question here. As you know, the court proceedings are continuing, and so this is still unresolved at the court level. But we asked a simple question: do you believe Donald Trump had top secret and other classified material or national security documents at his home in Mar-a-Lago this summer? And 66% say yes, he did. 34% say no, he did not. Those numbers are virtually unchanged from September, when it was 67% that he had secret documents, 34% that he had not. And here the partisan differences are striking. Among Republicans, fully 2/3 say he did not have secret or classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Just 34% say he did. That flips with independents. 64% say he did have such documents, 36% not. And Democrats, 93% are convinced that he had secret documents, just 7% not. So here what we're watching is, first of all, how have people responded to the search warrant, the news stories about the evidence, the court proceedings. But as these court proceedings continue, one of the interesting questions is, will the public change its perceptions in light of any rulings or future events? Or is this baked in? Not in this survey, but in telephone surveys in Wisconsin. We've sometimes had people volunteer that, yeah, he had documents, but he declassified them before he took them there. So these are folks that have heard the argument that some Trump supporters or Trump himself have made about them, not denying the presence, but denying the classification status. So it's a very interesting question about how people hear arguments from political elites, some that they agree with those elites, some that they disagree with those elites, and then they see evidence, in this case literally courtroom evidence eventually, and how they process all of that. So the question here is, how does this question, or the answers to this question, change over time, if it changes at all over time? So a continuing saga here as well that we'll be asking about now, so that 5 years from now we can look back and sort of see how this all shaped up.
The great virtue of doing rounds of polling like this as frequently as we do here at the Marquette Law School is that you can track things across time, and we certainly will continue to do that, both looking at Wisconsin and looking at the nation, and particularly at the U.S. Supreme Court. So stay tuned. We will have more polls. It's not quite the same as prior to the election, as far as what the pace will be, but nonetheless, our interest, and we hope our public service in doing this, will continue. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. And all the details of these polls and all our prior polls are online at law.marquette.edu/poll. We hope we can keep providing you with interesting material to think about and understand. Thank you again.
Thank you.